Hello, this is Fred Stella, the current host of Common Threads. The show now has been on for, going on 25 years. It debuted in September of 1996, September 4th to be exact. At the time, I was a part of the Interfaith Dialogue Association, as I am now. I was serving as vice president on the board of directors. And we had the idea for a show. Actually, it came from our president back then, Dr. Lillian Siegel. And through her, we had a connection to Grand Valley State University, which had the NPR affiliate radio station and television station, by the way, of WGVU. And she approached them and said, we'd like to do a radio program on interfaith dialogue. And they said, sure. Well, because I had significant radio experience, I was looked at to be the host. But I did not want to be the host. I had a pretty full schedule at the time. And so there was some concern as to, well, who's going to do this? Fortunately, there was a gentleman working as a producer there at WGVU who wanted a little on-air experience. And he volunteered, said, I'll handle the duties. He was an intelligent young man, and his name was Mark Evan Jackson. And for about a year, he hosted the show. Now, after about a year, he left, moved from Grand Rapids to Detroit, and joined the comedy troupe Second City. He stayed there for a couple of years or so, and then he moved on to Los Angeles, where he has had a very impressive career as an actor. At this moment, he is working at portraying Steve Jobs in a movie entitled Scroll Wheel of Time. He has also been on Parks and Recreation, Brooklyn 999, American Dad. He just has a list that goes on and on. Curb Your Enthusiasm, Kong, Skull Island. I'm reading his Internet Movie Database site right now, and again, the gentleman has had an impressive time in Hollywood. I'm not going to suggest that my future is going to be anything like Mark Evan Jackson's, but it's pretty great to know that we have an alumnus who is so successful. Anyway, recently I came across a cassette copy of the very first program, and I thought I would offer it here as a podcast. The people who are involved in the interview with Mark are Dr. Lillian Siegel, the president of Interfaith Dialogue Association, also board members Ghazala Munir and Madhuri Acharya, a delightful woman who has since passed on, as well as Dorothy Powell, also, who is no longer with us, but served the cause of interfaith dialogue in West Michigan proudly and very, very well. The interview is conducted by Mark, and also part of the cast is Dr. Leonard Swidler from Temple University, who, on a national level, is one of the godfathers of the interfaith movement and the creator of what we call the Dialogue Decalogue. So please enjoy this particular episode of Common Threads, and also note at the end, when Mark gives all of the information, that a lot of it isn't valid. No, we will not send you a cassette copy of this program. The telephone number doesn't work, and the electronic mail address for Mark no longer works. Nonetheless, I think you'll enjoy this episode very much.
This is Common Threads, an interfaith dialogue. Today marks the first of our programs, and we will be talking about religion. What is the history of interfaith dialogue? What are the ground rules and parameters? And what is the aim of such conversation? These questions and more will be discussed with members of the local Interfaith Dialogue Association and Dr. Leonard Swidler, Professor of Interreligious Dialogue at Temple University. Stay with us. This is the first program of Common Threads, and the discussion you will hear next is somewhat different from those to follow, inasmuch as today we will attempt to define the term interfaith dialogue. In future programs, we will talk about various aspects of faith and religion, such as good and evil, salvation, the creation myths, women in faith, evangelism, the nature of religion itself, and other subjects of the like. Also, today's program differs from the norm with respect to the number of guests participating. We will talk with Dr. Lillian Siegel, a member of the Jewish faith, Madhuri Acharya, a member of the Hindu faith, Dr. Michael DeWild, a member of the Buddhist faith, Ghazala Munir, a member of the Muslim faith, and Dorothy Powell, a Roman Catholic Christian. Joining us by telephone is Dr. Leonard Swidler, Professor of Interreligious Dialogue at Temple University. More typically, we will speak with 2 or 3 guests, but in this case, each of the participants was instrumental in the creation of this show, and we wanted them to be present for the first broadcast. Regrettably, not every religion or worldview will be represented on every program. Our radio format and the constraints of an hour simply don't allow for it. The goal of this program is not to promote one religion over another, or to promote religion at all, for that matter. Our hope is merely to provide a forum for adherents to different faiths to discuss their beliefs, to compare and contrast, and to learn. We also want to express the rich cultural and spiritual diversity that exists right here in West Michigan. We hope you enjoy this program, and we welcome your feedback. This is Common Threads, an interfaith dialogue. I'm Mark Evan Jackson. Or what is the definition of interfaith dialogue? Dr. Lillian Siegel.
Well, I think it's important to perhaps begin with saying what it is not. Interfaith dialogue is certainly not monologue, which is to say that when one enters into dialogue, one does not do that with the intent of converting one's dialogue partner. One needs to do it in a very honest way, in a very open way. One needs to listen to one's dialogue partner, and to put it in more positive terms then, the objective of interfaith dialogue is to learn, to grow, to even be transformed in the course of learning about the faith of another person.
Leonard Swidler, what are the origins of interfaith dialogue?
Well, I suppose in many ways it goes way, way back. But as far as the modern manifestation of it is concerned, in a way you can trace it back 100 years to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. That seems to be about the first time it really made a splash in, you might say, not only North America but Western civilization. And there was a beginning of a sort of organized effort after that, but it didn't really go too terribly far. What did happen, however, is in the beginning of the century is one dimension of it really got started, namely dialogue within the Catholic Church of the many different denominations and churches began to launch what gets to be known as the ecumenical movement that starts really in 1910 and 1912. And that grows and grows, and finally the World Council of Churches is founded in 1948, pulls together lots of the Protestant churches, mainline churches, some of the Orthodox Christian churches. And then the Second Vatican Council in the Catholic Church, 1961 to 65, that really got the Catholic Church deeply involved both in dialogue with other Christians, but also into interreligious dialogue. And the World Council of Churches had already begun to expand beyond simply talking with other Christians to talking to non-Christians in the late 1950s. So that's when it really becomes a modern movement.
Dr. Swidler, this is Michael DeWild. I was curious, to what extent do you think that was spurred on by the advent of modern anthropology, or the growth of science, the world becoming smaller, that sort of thing, as relativism becomes a more acceptable orthodoxy among anthropologists, descriptive or normative. Religious folks feeling that they better get behind the ball on this one or be left behind.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that all kinds of things are happening since the Enlightenment, since the end of the 18th century, which is also the birth time of our nation. And from that time forward, you've got really what we call the modern period that we're living in now. And one of the things that happens is our understanding of how we human beings understand things becomes radically transformed in the process of these last 200 years. And that is, I would also say, as you indicated, the broad context within which our openness to dialogue then becomes not only a possibility, but increasingly an absolute necessity.
The openness to dialogue is a necessity. Would you account that as reason for failure in the past, all the evidences you gave up until fairly recent times?
Well, in the sense that until 150 years or so ago, everybody in the world was totally convinced that their view of the truth was the only correct one. It was exhaustive. It said everything there was to say about the ultimate meaning of life and how to live according to that explanation, and that's what a religion is. And anybody that differed from that explanation of the meaning of life, to the extent that they differed, well, they obviously were just mistaken. And so you then responded to them, maybe with indifference and ignoring them on one end of the spectrum, all the way to you're going to convert them or kill them in the process at the other end. But when we begin to realize that no matter what we say about some aspect of reality, not only in the area of religion, but just anything, it's always going to be limited. We can't possibly say everything about anything, and even if what we say is in fact accurate, it's not everything you can say about it. So when that begins to dawn on us, then we begin to see that, hey, maybe I can learn something about an aspect of reality from somebody who's looking at it from a different perspective than I am. Now that then opens us up to the possibility of dialogue, and as that understanding of our understanding grows, then it becomes even a necessity, because we are by nature seekers of truth. We want to know everything we possibly can about reality. And so one very important way of learning about reality, we now realize, is by talking with people who see reality from a perspective different from ours.
Certainly, certainly. What would, for some of the others of you here in studio, what would be your definition of interfaith dialogue? Why is it something that you find meaningful and that you enjoy participating in? Madhurya Acharya.
Well, what happens is, even on a day-to-day practical level, we need to know what the other person is like and what they think, because now that we are with other people all the time. First, we didn't know, we just had our kind of people, whatever that kind was. And now that we have neighbors and friends and people that we work with and people that we spend so much time with who belong to have different ideas and have different ways of looking at reality, we need to know something about what they think, so we can really ultimately all think that we are, as we go deeper, we are more similar than what we think we are. We are not as far different than what we think.
Certainly.
I believe that cultures are so deeply rooted in religions and faith that in order to know each other and to know each other's cultures, I found out when I immigrated to the United States about 20-some years ago, that it was very important for me to understand the religion of my neighbor, and it grew beyond to religion of the community, to go to the churches, to sit in on some of the congregations and understand what that religion is before I could understand the true culture of this country.
Now, do you think that that is hard work that's not easily undertaken by many? Certainly, it's something that we're experiencing here in West Michigan at this point. Is our, and I'm certain it goes on everywhere, is still feelings of one's religion being superior and the end-all and be-all, and certainly the baseline for all truth. It's something we're experiencing here in West Michigan with respect to the Reverend Richard Rim and his church in Spring Lake.
If I could ask Dr. Swidler a question about just that. I was just curious in listening to your talk, and you look around the world, and I don't know if you would agree with it or not, but interfaith dialogue, to the ends that people have been stating, still seems to be in its infancy. Do you think that lay people are in some ways better suited to this conversation than theologians and philosophers? I think about the conversations I hear among lay people and their openness to that, and then the kind of nitpicking and doctrinaire, one-upmanship that theologians and philosophers engage in. And I wonder if somehow theologians and philosophers would be better left out of this conversation in some way. I don't know if you want to, as an academic, I don't know if you want to comment on that or not.
Well, I guess I find it just varies a great deal, and it doesn't really seem to depend so much on, let's say, the status of the persons or the groups involved. I mean, sometimes some groups of lay people seem to be very open. Some other groups of lay people can be very adamant and very aggressive in the other direction. And the same is also true of academics, I think. And it also depends, I think, on which particular religious group you're talking about. I find, for example, that there has been, with the Catholic Church, with the Second Vatican Council, there's been such a radical turn toward dialogue that it is very difficult for anybody, even the most authoritative elements in the Catholic Church, to run against the orientation toward dialogue. For example, my wife and I founded the Journal of Ecumenical Studies, which is a scholarly quarterly devoted to ecumenical and interreligious affairs some 34 years ago. In that time, I think probably approaching 70% of the unsolicited manuscripts that we get come out of from Catholic scholars, simply because so much commitment on the highest authoritative level in the Catholic Church has been in favor of dialogue. Now, that was a radical change from before 1961. I mean, I know that very well because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the history of it all leading up to 1961. I finished the dissertation in 1960. And it's like night and day. So us older Catholics know very well what it's like to be opposed to dialogue, because that was our mental attitude. We were following orders from headquarters. But now it's exactly the opposite. So it depends to a great extent on what the leadership in the various religious communities provides.
Dorothy Powell, as a member of the Catholic faith, what has your experience been with respect to laymen being open to, lay people being open to the interfaith dialogue and those on a more scholarly or clerical level?
Well, I'm sure Dr. Swidler has said that much more adequately than I can. In terms of pastoral practice of the folks in the pews, I think it is hard sometimes for the people who write the books and the people who formulate the doctrines and the academics and theologians to realize that even in spite of the 30 years, some that have passed since the documents were written, much of it has not filtered down to all the folks in the pews. I think it is true that I find at least little of any resistance to dialogue, so much as perhaps still fear of it among Catholics.
Certainly. I'd like to remind those listening at this point that we are talking about religion here on Common Threads on 88.5 FM and 1480 AM WGVU. Lillian Siegel, we are in an area that some might think to be unlikely territory for interfaith dialogue, and yet we have present here the Interfaith Dialogue Association. What were the origins of that? When did that begin, and what has your experience been with people's openness to interfaith dialogue?
We began this organization, and when I say we, I mean the Reverend Marcine Rienstra, who is was the first woman to graduate from Calvin Theological Seminary, and is now currently a minister in the Reformed Church of America. Reverend Marcine Rienstra and I began this organization in 1989 as a kind of pilot project, and we were experimenting with the idea of people from various faith traditions coming together in one another's homes to share our traditions and learn from one another, and then to see if out of that experiment we could then establish an ongoing organization. And so we did find that there was indeed a deep interest in doing this, and that it was very enjoyable and very productive. And so in 1990 we became incorporated, and we had our first annual conference with Leonard Swidler, who is now dialoguing with us. He was our first keynote speaker. So that's how it got started, and our interest was in dialoguing across religions, both East and West, although I should also add that when Marcine Rienstra and I decided to begin this initiative, we were kind of building on a vision that my late husband, Philip Siegel, had, which was to establish an ecumenical center in Grand Rapids. He was a rabbi and a New Testament scholar who focused mainly on Jewish-Christian dialogue. And so we wanted to take that vision and broaden it to include as many religions as we possibly could.
I see. I'm curious to know, those with us here in studio today have been instrumental in the formation of this program, meeting for, goodness, probably the last 6 months in preparation for it. I'm curious to hear a bit from each of you on your association with the Interfaith Dialogue Association here in town, here in Grand Rapids, and how long you've been with it and what your experience has been.
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate Lillian and Marcine on air for the establishment of this wonderful center. And it has indeed become a reality that people of all faiths are coming together. And I started with them perhaps as one of the founding members, and I have that honor or privilege of saying that. And I do believe that it really is a grassroots effort. Most of our people who are on this dialogue group are grassroots people. For example, myself, I'm neither a philosopher nor a theologian, or perhaps maybe an aspiring theologian, but I do believe that it is people like me, people like Madhuri and others who do come together every month and dialogue with each other. And I think that has it has a very pragmatic effect.
But I would also, while our group is certainly, as Ghazala has indicated, is a grassroots group in the sense that we are not just scholars who come together to intellectualize about these various religions and compare them from very arcane perspectives, perhaps sometimes, that we are people who are just common folk, as it were. We're not meaning to use that word pejoratively, of course. But we also include people from the academic world. We include clergy, as well as non-theologians, non-clergy. But I think it's very important that the people who are the academicians do that work and give us the information, give us the framework from which we can grow and understand the origins of religion, how religions evolve and change, how religions do indeed incorporate elements of one another, how religions unfortunately have fought with one another and have taken absolutist positions, but also how in recent centuries, as Professor Widler has told us, beginning perhaps with the Parliament of World Religions in 1893, and then moving along in the way that he indicated with the growth of the ecumenical movement among Christians, and then with the work of Vatican II, and now into the 1990s, and in the 1990s, of course, we had a celebration of the centennial of the Parliament of World Religions in 1993. And so we have this growing interfaith movement. And it's important to anchor that movement, I think, in the scholarly work of academicians. And I think that there are many academicians who are doing this work and sort of do it off in their ivory towers, and that they need to make this material more accessible to the laity, to share it with people so that people will approach it then with a sense of deeper respect and perhaps less fear if they see that clergy and academicians are endorsing this kind of activity, that it's, to use a Jewish word, kosher, that it's fit and appropriate to do, then perhaps they will be willing to engage in it.
Michael DeWild, as an academician, what has been your experience with the interfaith?
I'm willing. I'll do it. My own experience starts, I suppose, internally. I mean, I'm something of a walking interfaith dialogue association by myself. If you see me, talking to myself and waving my arms down the street, it's because maybe I'm having this conversation. I was born and raised in the Christian tradition. I'm what Houston Smith would call a cultural Christian, in the sense I love Christmas, I love Easter, I love the smells and bells, the music. It's all part of who I am.
Certainly.
And came to Buddhism out of both psychological and philosophical reasons. So I'm certainly both internally and with my students actively engaged in understanding not only what the religious traditions are and are about and purport to say, but the extent to which they are not just similar, but dissimilar as well, and not covering over where they are dissimilar. And can I follow up on that with Dr. Swidler for just a minute?
Actually, we need to take just a short break, but you'll be welcome to do so after that. Again, you're listening to Common Threads, an interfaith dialogue. We'll be back to talk more about that very subject here on 88.5 FM and 1480 AM WGVU. I'm Mark Evan Jackson.
I'm Noah Adams. We know you have a lot to do today, and we know it would be asking too much to expect you to keep track of everyone else in the world and what they're up to. So the staff of All Things Considered is prepared to make you a deal. Tune in on your way home, and we'll bring you up to date on what happens today. You do your job, we'll do ours, and be sure to join us for NPR's All Things Considered.
All Things Considered, 4 o'clock this afternoon at AM 1480 and 88.5 FM WGVU.
I'm Ray Suarez. What if reporters always asked the question on your mind? What if the media always listened to your ideas? On NPR's Talk of the Nation, we give you the opportunity to make sure that happens. We throw your questions and your comments into the mix every day. On Talk of the Nation from NPR News.
Talk of the Nation, 2 o'clock this afternoon at AM 1480 WGVU.
This is Common Threads, an interfaith dialogue. I'm Mark Evan Jackson. We're talking today with Lillian Siegel, Dr. Lillian Siegel, a member of the Jewish faith, Madhuri Acharya, a member of the Hindu faith, Dr. Michael de Wilde, a member of the Buddhist faith, Ghazala Munir, a member of the Muslim faith, Dorothy Powell, a member of the Catholic faith, and joining us by telephone is Dr. Leonard Swidler, professor of interreligious dialogue at Temple University. We were talking before the break about the individuals here in studio and your experience with the Interfaith Dialogue Association here in Grand Rapids. Let's continue that, if we may, for just a moment. Madhuri Acharya.
Ghazala and I have known each other for many, many years, and guess in 91, she calls me up and she says, there's this meeting at my house, and there's all different people from different religions are coming, and I think you will enjoy this. So I said, fine, I'll come over to your house, and that's how it started. And I met everybody, and everybody was so really nice and wonderful, and I enjoyed myself. And this was something that I had always been interested in, coming from where I am originally, living with people of different religions, and learning to live and living. That this was something that I really wanted to follow more deeply, and that was the beginning, and that was 91. So it's been about 5 years now for me.
Very good. And Dorothy Powell.
Some years ago, I heard Rabbi Siegel speak at a Catholic institution on rabbinic Judaism, and went away realizing I had learned more about Eucharist that night than I had known before, and that intrigued me.
How can that be?
It was, and because Rabbi Siegel was a great scholar, and an expert on the Gospel of Matthew. He also invited the congregation to use his library, which I couldn't resist, which led me into the Jewish adult studies groups and Hebrew classes, and went from there quite naturally into the beginnings of this interfaith dialogue group. I'd have to say, I think what led me was not so much intellectual curiosity, because I really could have gotten most of the things we've been talking about from books. What I have gained from interfaith dialogue is not what I could have got from books. It is
the human element?
It's the human element. It's following the heart. It's discovering in human beings my own faith reflected back and magnified and enriched.
Very good, very good. I just remembered that Michael de Wilde, I offered the opportunity for you to follow up. Would you like to do that now?
Sure, Dr. Swidler.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can help me with this one. I sometimes think that Interfaith Dialogue Association, or Interfaith Dialogue as an activity, is something that one comes to maybe after a fairly long period of time, life experience, growth of intellectual curiosity, that sort of thing. That's a very difficult thing to manufacture among 18 or 19-year-olds in a classroom. To go maybe into the to one of the direct questions, if I've got somebody in class, who's saying, "Look, that's all that stuff sounds really nice, but in order for me to be a Christian, I've got to proclaim the Word of God as I understand it. I'm not so much interested in dialogue as I am in professing my faith, and that's how I understand what it means to be a Christian. I'm not sure where the invitation or opening is for interfaith dialogue."
Well, one of the things I would say is that you might find some interesting help in reading a book by James Fowler called Stages of Faith. I think it was published in 1980. At any rate, he was following the work of Kohlberg and Piaget and Erickson, other very well-known scholars in psychology of this most recent generation. And what Fowler does is he traces the development, or let's say the maturing of faith, whether it doesn't matter what faith it is. It doesn't even have to be what we would call a religious faith. It could even be a substitute for it, like some ideology, let's say atheistic Marxism. In other words, it functions as an explanation of the ultimate meaning of life and how to live according to that explanation, so it permeates your whole life in that sense. Well, he finds that there are something like 6 stages, as he outlines it, in this maturation process. And, well, you start out, of course, you're just learning, and you get to a point where you begin to try to make sense out of things for yourself. You don't simply learn bits and pieces by rote, but you try to integrate it. And eventually you may get to the point where you can, as it were, get it all together, as we used to say back in the 60s. And what's interesting is the way he outlines it is when you're at stage 4 of this 6-stage development, that's when you sort of get it all together. You've got all your ethical principles, your explanation to yourself, what life is all about, all figured out and integrated in some kind of meaningful way. Well, then when you begin to move to stage 5, you begin to realize that there are other people who have also got it all together, but guess what? They got it all together on different bases than you do. And now you then begin to ask yourself the question, wonder how they did it? Because you can see the way they are living, that they are living a really integrated, fully human life. You'd say a holy life, because that's what holy means. It means to be whole, healthy. And so you then begin to open yourself up to dialogue. Interesting statistic. You don't get normally to stage 4 until about age 30. Why? Because you haven't had enough life experience to allow you to get it all together. Also interesting statistic is from those people that he interviewed, and he was very careful to try to get a relatively representative sample of North America, who are age 30 and above, 35% of them are at stage transition from 4 to 5 or above. That means that if his sample is at all accurate, a third of the people who are 30 years old or older in the United States are open to and are needing dialogue. Now, he then asks the question, well, where are the institutions, the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, the temples? Somewhere around between stage 2 and 3 is where he finds them. So there is a real problem of tension in their institution vis-a-vis this group of maturing people. And you wonder, have they voted with their feet, walked out of the temple, mosque, synagogue, church, etc., because they are not being nurtured, not being fed the kind of meat that they should be getting, but are being fed pablum. Now, as far as your 18-year-olds are concerned, it's going to be tough for exactly the reason that I suggested. They haven't had enough life experience to be able to really get it all together. Nevertheless, I find that with the right kind of approach and reading material, most of them really do move in this direction. They get on a kind of accelerated path in the direction of dialogue. At least that's been my experience at Temple University, which is, a state university with lots of streetcar sort of students who come in who work 40 hours a week. Just the regular, everyday urbanite.
It's my guess that if you were to ask the average 18 or 19-year-old if they had it all together, they'd say certainly they do.
They do.
They would all profess. I see some of those with kids nodding their heads. Fire away.
I'd also like to respond to the question that Michael posed. Michael, of course, is a colleague of mine at Grand Valley State University. We're in different departments. But I find in teaching my students at Grand Valley, and one of my students is actually here working as an intern, Kristen Palma. I think she will confirm what I'm about to say, and that is that I try to get my students to open up to the notion of paradigm shifts. There's a theologian by the name of Hicks, I believe, I think his name is John Hicks, who talks about the need for a theological paradigm shift. And he uses the analogy of the Copernican revolution, which was a revolution in thinking that moved the worldview from the old, what was called the Ptolemaic worldview, which saw the Earth as the center of the universe and all the other planets revolving around it, moving from that paradigm, that conceptual framework, to one which argued that the sun was the center of the universe, the heliocentric view. So that was the Copernican view. Well, John Hicks then says, taking this as an analogy to a shift, a theological shift, he argues that the old worldview religiously, particularly for Christendom, was to see to place Christianity at the center, as though Christianity were kind of the sun, and all the other religions had a veracity in terms of its closeness to the Christian sun. But the shift, he then says, needs to move to the notion that the sun is God, and that all the religions of the world circle around this center, which is God, which is a source of light and nourishment, and which all the religions of the world reflect. And so when I teach my students, I don't know whether you've done this, Michael, but I like to use this notion of paradigm shift. Of course, it's an expression that comes out of the philosophy of science and Thomas Kuhn, who talked about the structure of scientific revolutions and used that expression, paradigm shift. But I think that it's very critical that students, and not only students in universities, but people in general, become conscious of this notion of a shift of consciousness, so that they will forsake the old ways of thinking, the old absolutist ways of thinking, the old ways that insist that there's only one way of seeing the truth, and if you're willing to open up to the multiplicity of truths, that in some way you are jeopardizing your own faith.
Certainly. That's something that we've experienced here in this studio in preparation for these programs which we will broadcast. We've witnessed correlations between, and differences, of course, but certainly some correlations in the multiplicity of truths. Have any of you, since you've begun your dialogue, your interfaith dialogue, found substantial changes of paradigm or changes in your own perception of your religion? Does, and I mean this not pejoratively, but does interfaith dialogue at all threaten the integrity of the individual faiths? Let's throw it out there.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
On that? I have been involved in interreligious dialogue for 40 years now, and I would have to say that not only for myself, but for 99.9% of the other people who I have encountered who have been seriously involved or engaged in interreligious dialogue, they have not, and I have not, shifted away from, in my case, my Catholic Christianity, but rather the experience is one of a deepening and enriching of one's self-understanding in one's own tradition.
Is that something that the rest of you have found to be the case as well?
I was going to point out that I believe it is part of the document that Dr. Swidler himself has written. Is it part of the Decalogue? Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Swidler, that you have to be grounded in your faith before you can begin to dialogue with other faiths?
Well, you want to be, at any rate, as grounded as you can be, right, given your particular status. That's right. I mean, let's put it this way. You want to be someone who is committed to it, whether your knowledge is vast or medium or little. You just want to start out from a commitment.
Yeah, and I find this so compelling because I remember entering dialogue how little I knew about my own faith, and having talked to people of different faiths, how it reflected back, and I became more and more convinced that, yes, my faith, what I profess, is perfect for me, but then there are other faiths which are just as perfect.
I have never found dialogue to be threatening to my faith. Certainly it has been challenging. And I think when Lillian was mentioning the new paradigm with the Son, the God Son as center, rather than any given religion, that is a little more difficult perhaps for Christians than for some when that God center is exclusively incarnated in our prophet. Things get a little sticky there in interfaith dialogue. I think the greatest help I found in feeling safe, in centering myself in dialogue, was Leonard Swidler's book, Yeshua, A Model for Moderns, which I believe was one of the very first things that we read and discussed together, which gave me a perspective in which to deal with my faith in Jesus as the Christ and still be very free and open in dialogue.
Yeah, being brought up as a Hindu, I was always taught that there is not just one way of doing something, and the tolerance and acceptance of the other's way of, and their viewpoint was very, very important. So I never really felt threatened about learning. And the way I look at it is that even if I'm not well grounded in my own faith, if there's something that I like that somebody else is following, I can take it and make it my own. And that's what I've always looked at it that way.
Ghazala Munir, you mentioned the dialogue decalogue. Why don't we sort of highlight that now and go through that quickly if we can? We're using that as something of a ground rule for the conversation here on Common Threads. Dr. Swidler, what was the origin of the dialogue decalogue?
Well, in a certain sense, I guess you could say it was just experience, and then writing down in as clear and simple language as I possibly could what my experience and the experience of others seems to indicate, have some sort of do's and don'ts. If you want to have dialogue, well, then these are the kinds of things that you want to look out for. And when you go through them, most of them are very, very commonsensical, but it's kind of astounding how often human beings, when they get together and they get excited and they're talking, forget plain, ordinary, common sense things. It's sort of like people get excited when they're standing on the edge of the cliff and they forget about the law of gravity, and whoops, it's too late when they're falling. Mm-hmm. So that's the way it happened. It started out in the early 80s. I think I had maybe 4 or 5 principles that I laid down in writing and got some feedback, and eventually, I think by about 10 years ago, it got to the form that it's in now, which is, well, there are 10 sort of guidelines or commandments, I call them. I suppose I could have worked at it and made 11 or really squashed them together, got 9. But obviously in our culture of Christendom, now become Western civilization and on the way to becoming global civilization, a decalogue is a good mnemonic scheme, at any rate for all of those coming out of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. So it just helps us to remember them more easily. It could be another number, but...
Certainly. Lillian Siegel, would you quickly go through them, if you would, sort of laying down the baseline for what will be the ground rules for our conversations here on this show, and then we'll comment on how they've played out. I would like to hear some personal experiences with when the rules have been called into play.
Okay, I will render what Leonard Swidler has commanded us. Dialogue, well, these are abbreviated commandments, which we include in the Interfaith Dialogue Association's brochure. Dialogue to learn, to change, to grow and act accordingly. Dialogue to share and receive from others. Dialogue with honesty and sincerity. Dialogue comparing ideals with ideals and practice with practice. Dialogue to define yourself and to learn the self-definition of others. Dialogue with no hard and fast assumptions about someone else's beliefs. Dialogue to share with equals. Dialogue in trust. Dialogue with willingness to look at your beliefs and traditions critically. dialogue seeking to understand the other person's beliefs from within. Would you like to hear which one is my favorite of them all?
I would have it no other way.
Well, I like the one that says dialogue with willingness to look at your beliefs and traditions critically. And that is something that I have found that is an experience that many of us in the Interfaith Dialogue Association share, and feel that after we build a level of trust that we have a safe place when we meet to talk about our gripes, as it were, about our own religions. And I think that is critical, no pun intended, to be critical of one's own tradition, to be willing to look at that tradition and question it, because, to paraphrase Aristotle, it was Socrates, who said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, I would add the unexamined religious life is not worth living. And so one of the values of interfaith dialogue is that it very often challenges us to take a very deep and penetrating and often critical look at our tradition, and to be moved perhaps to work to transform and improve and change that tradition.
Very good. Others of you, your experience with the Decalogue Dialogue, the experience of looking at one's own religion critically, and also dealing with ideal to ideal and real to real. What have your experiences been with respect to that? I mean, certainly there must be instances where the temperature in the room goes up and emotions flare, things along those lines. Ghazala Munir?
First of all, I would go back to Dr. Swidler talking about the Enlightenment, and I would want to go back further yet into history and talk about what the Quran says about dialogue and getting to know each other. And there is a surah where God is speaking to humankind, saying, we made you into nations and tribes, into races, and gave you the modes of language and speech and other forms of ideals so that you could get to know each other. So I based my concept of interfaith dialogue on that notion of the Quran. And I would agree, I would concur with Lillian on that. That happens to be my favorite one too, because this is an arena where I can come and I can gripe about the problems that I've had within my faith. Once I built that level of trust with my colleagues, but it had to, in order to have an authentic dialogue, I do believe that you have to be self-critical, self-probing, and very, very honest.
Very good.
Let me just add to that. I think that's absolutely right, because the very definition of dialogue is I'm coming to talk with somebody who is religiously different from me, primarily so I can learn, not so I can teach the other one. But if I already know everything, if my tradition knows it all, never made any mistakes, obviously I can't learn anything. So I can't dialogue. So if I in fact want to dialogue, I have to be open to a self-criticism of my own tradition. Otherwise, dialogue, I have just ruled it out of existence by this very definition.
Dorothy Powell?
I'd throw in my vote for number 5.
Which one is that?
On a very practical level. Dialogue to define yourself and to learn the self-definition of others. And that is a commandment on which I have been known to call people now and then.
How well I remember, Dorothy.
Maybe I'm too sensitive to it, but I
think it's a good one.
To be such a tendency for people, everybody in the world who is not Catholic, to know exactly what Catholics believe and be very willing to tell us what we believe. And often they knew what we believed 40 years ago, and they don't know anymore.
Gotcha. Well, it's certainly something that we will explore from here on out on Common Threads. I'd like to thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Lillian Siegel, a member of the Jewish faith; Madhuri Acharya, a member of the Hindu faith; Michael DeWild, a member of the Buddhist faith; Ghazala Munir, a member of the Muslim faith; Dorothy Powell, a member of the Catholic faith; and Dr. Leonard Swidler, joining us by telephone, professor of interreligious dialogue at Temple University. Thank you all for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is Common Threads, an interfaith dialogue. Common Threads is a production of WGVU in cooperation with the Interfaith Dialogue Association, 458-0307. The participants on this program represent themselves and are not designated spokespeople for the faiths represented. The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, its underwriters, or Grand Valley State University. Our program is directed by Michael Packer. Rob Willey is the executive producer. Production assistance comes from Kristen Palma. I'm Mark Evan Jackson. To receive a cassette copy of this program, call us at 771-6666. We welcome your questions or comments. Write to us, care of Common Threads, 301 West Fulton, Grand Rapids, Michigan, 49504, or by electronic mail at mjackson@gvsu.edu. We thank you for listening. Join us next time.